everyone. Trying to see if I'm connected. Hope I am. Yeah, I think I'm definitely connected. Hello. I'm Shree. I'm your English educator for grades 11 and 12. I hope you're all having a good Thursday. We usually meet at this hour from 3 to 4 every day except Sunday, and we do grade 11 portions on Monday, Wednesday and Friday. Oh, I'm sorry, we do grade 12 portions on Monday, Wednesday and Friday, and we do grade 11 portions on Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday. Today we're starting a new lesson for grade 11. Hello to Tanu. We're doing a landscape of the soul. I have heard a lot of things about how people don't enjoy this lesson very much, and I can see why. It's a bit of a weird lesson. You don't entirely understand what's going on in it at all when you read it first. But I'm hoping that after we talk about it today, maybe you can see some more value in the lesson than you previously could. As always, feel free to ask me questions at any point. I'll keep checking the chat. Especially when I pause for water, I will generally check the chat. So yeah, and that said, shall we start? Okay, let me just, yes, laser pointer. Okay, Landscape of the Soul by Natalie Trevorroy. Who is Natalie Trevorroy? She is an art historian. She is from Belgium, and she was very interested in learning more about Chinese art, and so she eventually ended up writing this article called Landscape of the Soul: Ethics and Spirituality in Chinese Painting. And that's the longer title of this article. She's thinking about ethics and she's thinking about spirituality and what role both of these things have in painting in China, right? And that already immediately gives us some more context for the lesson that we're going to read today. We're going to be thinking about ethics, spirituality, and how it's connected to painting. And that's what has to do with this part of the title, Landscape of the Soul. Landscape, well, you know what that means. It's when you look at a particular scene and you try to depict what's in that scene, right? And you're looking at all of the features of that particular scene and you're trying to paint it, or you're trying to take a photograph of it. That's generally called a landscape when it doesn't involve people necessarily and it just involves the environment around you. And if you used to draw when you were a kid, then you know that whenever somebody said do a landscape drawing, then you'd probably draw mountains and stuff. So that's what landscape stands for here. But we also have landscape of the soul, and so we're going to think a little bit about how painting and portraits maybe have to do with the soul and this sort of spiritual part of human nature. And the title also, landscape, is a pun, right? It stands for two things. One, it stands for paintings themselves, and two, it stands for a detailed kind of description, a detailed kind of survey of the environment of the soul. So not only are we going to be talking about paintings, we're also going to be talking about the landscape of the soul or the features of the soul, and we're going to be talking about how both of them come together in this lesson. I hope that is clear so far, and with that said, we can get started with our lesson. A wonderful old tale is told about the painter Wu Daozi, who lived in the 8th century. So, we're starting with a story, and it's a story about a painter who lived very, very long ago, and he's a Chinese painter whose name is Wu Daozi. His last painting was a landscape commissioned by the Tang Emperor Xuanzong to decorate a palace wall. The master had hidden his work behind a screen, so only the emperor would see it. So, Wu Daozi's very last painting, which is to say he didn't paint anymore after this, and we'll see why, is a landscape, and it's a landscape that a particular emperor called Xuanzong asked him to paint, and he basically asked him to paint it on the palace wall so that they could decorate the palace wall. The master had hidden his work behind a screen, so only the emperor would see it. So this master painter has been painting, and he's sort of curtained off the segment in which he's working so that nobody can see it except for the emperor when he invites the emperor in. For a long while, the emperor admired the wonderful scene, discovering forests, high mountains, waterfalls, clouds floating in an immense sky, men on hilly paths, birds in flight. And now we get a description of the painting, which has forests in it, which has mountains in it, waterfalls and clouds in a large expansive sky, and there are men on it in it also who are going up like the parts of the mountain, and there are birds that are flying. So there's a lot of details to this painting that Wu Daozi has made, and the emperor really likes it, so he is looking at it for a really long period of time because it's caught his attention and his interest. Actually, one thing we should talk about here very quickly is that we see first a little bit of a system of patronage, right? We have somebody paying an artist to make a particular painting for them, and this is the way that art worked for, like, the royals were the peoples who kind of kept art thriving because they had the money to keep art going and to keep artists going. So a lot of art depended on royals and their wealth and them commissioning the work of the artists, and that's something we should remember. "Look, sire," said the painter, "in this cave at the foot of the mountain dwells a spirit." And the painter tells the king, "Look, sire." Sire is a sort of title that you use for kings sometimes. Some people use it for their fathers also, but it's basically a title of respect. And the painter says, "Look, in the cave, in this painting, this cave which is at the foot of the mountain in the painting, there is a spirit." A spirit being a sort of otherworldly being. The painter clapped his hands and the entrance to the cave opened. "The inside is splendid, beyond anything words can convey. Please let me show your majesty the way." So the painter claps his hands and the entrance to the cave inside the painting opens. And the painter says, "You know, it's really beautiful inside, and I can't really tell you how beautiful it is because it's far beyond like any words that I have to be able to tell you about it. So let me show you inside and come with me." And so this is an invitation, right? He is asking the emperor to enter the cave with him and meet the spirit with him. The painter entered the cave, but the entrance closed behind him, and before the astonished emperor could move or utter a word, the painting had vanished from the wall. And the painter goes inside the painting, into the cave, and the entrance shuts behind him, and the emperor is just left outside standing and staring, and before he can even do anything, the entire painting sort of disappears from the wall. Not a trace of Wu Daozi's brush was left. So not even a little bit of the paint that he'd used to paint all of these things was left. So the entire painting has left like it never existed. And the artist was never seen again in this world. And with the painting, the artist vanishes too. And so we find out why it is that this has been Wu Daozi's last painting. He's never seen again. So of course none of his paintings are ever seen again either. By which I mean, sorry, bad phrasing. By which I mean, he's not painted again in this world, at least. Very interesting things happening here. We're starting this chapter, and the first thing that we get is this mysterious story about a painter and a king, and it involves a spirit, which seems to go back to our title, which is Landscape of the Soul. So immediately we have this kind of otherworldliness that has been again, and that's how Natalie Troveroy tells us this story. She hears it too from somebody else. But there is something important about this story, as we will find. Tanu, majesty is a way to refer to a king also. So you say His Majesty if it's a king, and you sort of say Her Majesty if it's a queen. Majesty also means like something great. That's what the word means. And so it's something that's been used to refer to kings and queens as a title. I hope that makes sense. Such stories played an important part in China's classical education. The books of Confucius and Zhuangzi are full of them. They help the master to guide his disciple in the right direction. And so stories like this are very important in China and in education in China, which is to say that all of these stories contain some kind of message or some kind of learning that they want to convey. And we find out that the books of Confucius and Zhuangzi, and Confucianism is a particular philosophy. Confucius is a philosopher. Zhuangzi is a book of philosophy, and Zhuangzi is the person who was the philosopher who constructed that book. And both of these lines of philosophy are about ethics, they're about morality, they're about how people should live their lives, how we can live better lives, and these books are also full of these stories, which is to say that these philosophies also taught through stories, and they helped the master to guide his disciple in the right direction. A disciple is someone, it's a person who voluntarily decides that they want to learn a particular philosophy or a particular way of life, and so they sign up with a particular master, and the master helps them learn. They're like a newbie basically to that particular philosophical study. And so both of these philosophical practices are so important and were so important at particular points of time that there used to be schools of them, and people used to join them, and there used to be people who taught them how to follow these philosophies, and they used the stories in these books to teach these students how to follow these philosophies. It's a much more institutional kind of way of doing something that happens all the time, right? People tell us stories all the time to try to give us a particular kind of message. It's like the Panchatantra, for example. You read it and each story has like a particular moral at the end of it that's supposed to tell you a little something about how you should live. Yeah, it's something like that. Beyond the anecdote, they are deeply revealing of the spirit in which art was considered. Beyond just having stories, and beyond just being stories, these stories tell us a lot also about how people thought about art, and also these books themselves also tell us something about how people thought about art. And spirit in which art was considered is another like nice little pun. We have spirit right here, this otherworldly being that's there in the foot of the mountain, And here we have spirit used more as a the kind of energy, the kind of light in which art was considered. So the way that people thought about it, the sort of feeling that they brought towards it. Contrast this story or another famous one about a painter who wouldn't draw the eye of a dragon he had painted, for fear it would fly out of the painting, with an old story from my native Flanders that I find most representative of Western painting. So the author here is telling us that the story that she's just told us about Wu Dozi and the king tells us something about how art is considered in China. And in contrast, now she is going to tell us another story, and that story is going to be from her native place, which is Flanders, which is in Belgium. And she says that this story is representative of Western painting. And the contrast tells us that there is a distinction and a difference between the way painting is thought of in China and the way painting is thought of in the West. And we'll find out what that is soon. And the author also tells us that the story that she's told us about Wu Dozi has something in common with this particular story in the middle, about a painter who wouldn't draw the eye of a dragon he had painted for fear it would fly out of the painting. Which is to say that there was a painter once upon a time who drew a dragon and then didn't want to draw the eye of the dragon because he was afraid that the dragon would fly out of the painting. So this brings us the same kind of thing that happens in the Wu Dozi story, because Wu Dozi we saw goes into the painting, right? The painting is connected in some way to reality in the way that Wu Dozi can open the cave and then enter the painting. And here the fear is that the dragon will fly out of the painting if it is depicted very realistically, if the eye is drawn on it. So there's some sense of wonder around paintings here, and there's also some sense of connection to the paintings in a way that makes them extra ultra real. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a much clearer way after we talk about the contrast. I'm trying not to accidentally tell you more about what comes in later. What we get from this paragraph, one key theme that we get is about stories, right? It's about how stories can be used as a way to teach and how we use them as a way to communicate ideas. And that's what literature does all the time. And that's what we're doing here when we're studying all of these articles together and we're trying to see what they're doing. We're trying to think about all of the ideas in them. And it's very interesting that we're doing that while we're talking about how the article itself talks about stories and the ways that they are used to tell particular things to people. We also see this kind of distinction that's being made between China and Belgium, or Eastern art and Western art, and a connection between art and the place that it came from, which is to say that different places have different ideas of art, and so they do art in different ways. And that means that every place and its culture influences the kind of products that come out of that particular place. And this extends also to art, to stories even. You hear all sorts of different stories in China, you hear different kinds of stories in, say, maybe Flanders, and all of those are revelatory about particular things about that culture and certain ideas that that culture has about how life is to be lived and what's important about life and things like that, right? And we'll see a little bit more about what that means as we go to the next paragraph. If you have any questions, please ask me now. Hello to Gaming Buddy and Aishwarya Tinker. Good afternoon. I hope you're all having a good day. I'm going to grab some water and see if you have any questions. In the meantime, okay, Okay, I see no questions, so I will carry on. In 15th century Antwerp, quickly, two things. Antwerp is also in Belgium, but 15th century, 8th century, we see that these stories are very, very old stories. They're located in times that are long gone by, and yet we're talking about them in pretty recent times. This article isn't that old, right? It's written sometime in the 2000s, 2007 or something, I think. But yeah, it's quite a recent article, and we see how all of these old stories kind of filter down through the ages to the current day, and how they're still relevant in helping us understand different things about different places. That's something I wanted to note very quickly. A master blacksmith called Quentin Metzes fell in love with a painter's daughter. The father would not accept a son-in-law in such a profession. So, a blacksmith who works with metals falls in love with the painter's daughter, and the painter's like, I don't want a son-in-law who is a blacksmith. So, because of that, he is unwilling to let Quentin marry his daughter. So, Quentin sneaked into the painter's studio and painted a fly on his latest panel with such delicate realism that the master tried to swat it away before he realized what had happened. So what Quentin does is he kind of creeps into the painter's workspace, and on his latest panel, which is to say the latest piece that the painter has painted, he paints a fly on that piece. And he paints it with such delicate realism. Delicate means gentle, but also careful. In this particular context, it can be read to mean careful. Realism, it is extremely similar to how a fly looks when we see it like buzzing around, and it looks so real that the painter actually sort of like picks up like something and tries to kill the fly, and then realizes that it's actually been painted onto the painting. So that's a very impressive feat of painting, right? Quentin was immediately admitted as an apprentice into his studio. He married his beloved and went on to become one of the most famous painters of his age. And immediately he accepted Quentin. He said, okay, you can be an apprentice, which means a starting painter, a beginner in painting. And he taught Quentin painting, and Quentin went on to become a very famous painter, and he got to marry the person that he was in love with. These two stories illustrate what each form of art is trying to achieve. A perfect illusionistic likeness in Europe, the essence of inner life and spirit in Asia. And the author tells us that the two stories that she's told us about Wudozi and this one about Quentin tells us something about the way that art is thought about in Europe and Asia. And what art is in Europe is a perfect illusionistic likeness. What does that mean? An illusion is something that isn't real but seems very real, right? And so what art is trying to do in Europe, or the focus of art in Europe, is always to depict things as they are precisely, to capture every detail about something as it exists onto the canvas, right? And in Asia, there is less of a care for that, is what the author is telling us. Instead, what people care about when they paint in Asia is about the inner spirit and our inner lives. The story of Wudozi, for instance, he enters the painting, and then the painting disappears. So it's not really that he has cared for the painting itself per se, but rather that moment when you can enter the painting. And in the story, Wudozi literally walks inside the painting, right? But there are different ways that you can enter a painting. You can look at it and think about it. And if the painting is forcing you to think a bit, then that's a way of entering the painting, right? With your mind. And that's something that people in Asia are looking for you to do when they paint. And in fact, we see it again with Wudozi, because Wudozi invites the king inside the painting to see the spirit in the cave at the bottom of the mountain. The king can't follow him, and we'll talk about why that is in a bit also. but the invitation is there all the same, which means that painters like Wu Dorsey are looking for their audience to be able to follow them into the painting. Maybe not literally walk inside the painting, but spiritually, emotionally sort of pursue what's there in the painting. And I hope that is relatively clear. In the Chinese story, the emperor commissions a painting and appreciates its outer appearance, but the artist reveals to him the true meaning of his work. The emperor may rule over the territory he has conquered, but only the artist knows the way within. So in the Wu Dorsey story, the emperor asks the artist to paint a painting, and when he gets the painting, he can look at it and appreciate it, right? But he can't enter it behind the artist. It's the artist who tries to tell him, this is what my work means. And what does his work mean? We don't know, right? We only know that there is some sort of spirit, some sort of essence of meaning to his work that he says is there at this particular point in his painting, and the artist can go into it, but the emperor himself cannot. And so what the author tells us is that though all of the land that the artist has drawn in that painting has, in real life, in the real world, been controlled by the emperor, because he is the emperor of all of these lands. So though the landscape depicts lands that the emperor controls and has conquered, when it comes to the painting itself, it's only the artist who can kind of find his way into the work and see what's really going on there. And we'll clarify this too a little bit as we finish this paragraph. Let me show the way, the Tao, a word that means both the path or the method and the mysterious works of the universe. The painting is gone, but the artist has reached his goal, beyond any material appearance. So the artist, goes in first and says, let me show you the way. Which is this phrase that's an important part of Taoism. The way is also known as the Tao. And basically the word means not only like an actual path, like something for you to follow to get somewhere, but also the process, the journey that you can take in order to understand the way that the universe works, the way that something in specific works, the way that people work, and the way that life works, right? So the Tao is this thing that helps you kind of understand how to live your life, how to understand people, how to see what's going on in the universe and be at balance with the universe. And all of those are things that are implied in this little story when the painter says, oh, let's go to see the spirit at this particular place, and the painter goes inside the painting. The painter shows us that he understands his work and he understands the world in his work, and because of that he can enter it. Whereas the emperor cannot understand those things, and because of that the emperor cannot enter it. Now, one thing that we're going to find out in a little bit, but that I'm going to tell you about now to make things a little bit clearer, is that paintings themselves are a way for people to kind of think about how they work with the universe, right? And how they are at balance with the universe. So when Wu Dorsey enters this painting, he is also showing us that he is capable of being at balance with the world and understanding the ways that the world works. And when the emperor cannot enter it, what we realize is that the emperor perhaps is not at balance with the world and does not know how to understand it. And so all of that comes through also in that little story. And then finally, the last line. The painting is gone, but the artist has reached his goal beyond any material appearance. So the actual painting might be gone, but the artist has gone where he is meant to go, which is a place where he can understand the world and be at balance with it. And that is far beyond any sort of materiality, which is to say that this artist doesn't take value in the fact that he painted something and, oh look, this painting is here. but rather he takes value in what that painting gives him and where that painting takes him emotionally and spiritually, right? So it's a lot more than just owning like a physical copy of the work that he's done. It's a hierarchization that's being made here. We're being told that this path, this spiritual path, is a lot more important than material things like having just the painting itself. And so we should always look for more than just the outer appearance of the painting when it comes to art in Asia. And that's all that we got from those paragraphs. I'm going to check for questions. Hello to Vaishnavi, and okay, I am glad you have understood. That is good to know. If you have any questions, please ask right now. And hello to Mrunmai. That is a difficult name to wrap my mouth around. Nice to have you all here today. Okay, I don't see any questions, so I'm gonna keep talking, and please feel free to like drop questions as we go. A classical Chinese landscape is not meant to reproduce an actual view, as would a Western figurative painting. Whereas the European painter wants you to borrow his eyes and look at a particular landscape exactly as he saw it, from a specific angle, the Chinese painter does not choose a single viewpoint. His landscape is not a real one, and you can enter it from any point, then travel in it. Okay. Again, we're getting this kind of contrast being made here between a classical Chinese landscape and what European painters want. But we're also getting a similarity here, which is between classical Chinese landscape and Western figurative painting. Figurative painting is basically art that isn't very realistic. It's art that kind of, if you've seen like abstract-ish painting, that kind of depicts something but not really. That is a figurative painting. It's supposed to make us think about something, but it doesn't entirely look like that something. I realize I'm saying that and I don't have like an example to offer you. I wish I could like, I don't know, find a painting. But think about a jumble of shapes that looks like a water bottle rather than a water bottle itself being painted, right? So multiple like triangles and squares maybe that when you look at it for long enough you can see a water bottle in it, but it's not like an actual water bottle painted. That's figurative painting. It's trying to make you think of something, but it doesn't actually look like that something. Yes, and Chinese landscape painting also does that very same thing. So there is still a link between these two forms of, between these two different parts of the world, between China and the West, especially with regard to painting. The figurative painting there links back to how China thinks about, how China does art all the time, which is not drawing things as they are. And that's the contrast also that we see between European painters and Chinese painters, which is that when a European painter paints, he wants you to borrow his eyes and look at a particular landscape as he saw it. Which is to say, if I'm sitting here and I'm a European painter, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint everything in front of me exactly as I see it. So there's a sofa right there, so I'll paint a sofa and it'll be the exact colors that I see. It'll be the exact way that it looks under this specific kind of lighting. So everything will be incredibly precise and it'll be a copy of what I am looking at right now. But the Chinese painter doesn't do that. His landscape is not a real one in the sense that he isn't looking at something and imitating that. It's just a landscape. It's like multiple things may be patched together into a landscape. And it's got so many components in it that you can kind of look at any point and then go to another point and then go to another point and then go to another point. So lots of things in the Chinese landscape, as we saw in that particular like example of Wudozi. We have like people, we have paths, we have mountains, we have this, we have that, and you can look at any one particular point and then like look at the rest of it. The artist creates a path for your eyes to travel up and down, then back again in a leisurely movement. And leisurely also tells us something about the way that we're supposed to look at these Chinese paintings. You're supposed to spend some time with them, right? And you're supposed to kind of dwell in them and see what's going on in them and kind of try to understand what they're trying to give us, so to speak. So yeah, more abstract than entirely accurate, and not a real one is an interesting phrase also because there are real things in the painting, like mountains exist and waterfalls exist, and the painter has put all of those things together in that landscape. It just means that the painter hasn't like, if for instance I was a Chinese painter and I was sitting here and I was drawing what's here in front of me, I wouldn't draw the sofa exactly where it is, and I wouldn't draw the lighting exactly as it is, and I wouldn't draw all the things in the room exactly as they are. I'd put them in some kind of order. They'd be like there, somewhere. So real things that are there but not exactly as they are outside. So not an imitation, but rather I'd put it together, I'd put all of these things together in a way that maybe tells you something. For instance, maybe I'll draw like the sofa really large or something to indicate my tendency to rest, or human tendencies to rest. This is a very bad example, but yeah, that kind of like difference between reality and art is there in Chinese painting. And so this painting is more a way for you to contemplate and to think, and it takes you some more time. So it's a little bit of a journey for you and your mind. And let me know if that's making sense and if that's clear. Yes, Vaishnavi, that is exactly right. A figurative painting is when the painting looks like a water bottle, but it isn't like actually like a water bottle. For instance, I wouldn't like, if I just drew this again, that would be like a realistic painting, right? But if I used I don't know, let me try to, yeah, if I used like little like triangles or stuff like that, and I was like, oh, this is, this looks like a water bottle, it's a bad drawing again. But yeah, and you look at it and you're like, oh, that looks like a water bottle. That's figurative painting. And I'm gonna erase that so nobody ever has to see that again. It's truly terrible, but I hope you will, imagine things improve. This is even more true in the case of the horizontal scroll, in which the action of slowly opening one section of the painting, then rolling it up to move on to the other, adds a dimension of time which is unknown in any other form of painting. So there's something called a horizontal scroll, which is something that you open up. So it's a scroll that's wrapped up like this, and you can open it up, and you can open it up, and you can open it up, and you can basically keep opening new segments. And that's what the author is talking about here. And the author says that adds a dimension of time to a painting, which means basically that it's going to take you time to open up these segments, right? When you look at like a regular painting that is just in the form of like a rectangle or a square or whatever it is, but you can look at the entire painting at the same moment. Whereas when you open up that scroll, there is new things emerging all the time. And so that also brings in a little bit of an element of a journey. You're traveling from one section to the other section to the other section to the other section. It also requires the active participation of the viewer, who decides at what pace he will travel through the painting. A participation which is physical as well as mental. So when the viewer is unwrapping the painting, the viewer needs to really pay attention to it, and the viewer gets to choose at what speed they get to like look at the next section. So I can spend like 5 minutes looking at this section and then unravel to the next section, right? So I get to decide at what points of time I'm looking at how much of the painting, and physically I get to decide this in the sense that I get to unwrap it and look at it with my eyes, but I get to decide this on mental terms also, which is to say I get to decide how much of the painting I want to engage with right now and think about right now. The Chinese painter does not want you to borrow his eyes, he wants you to enter his mind. The landscape is an inner one, a spiritual and conceptual place. Here we get a repetition of the line that we had just now, which is that the Chinese painter doesn't want you to see exactly what he's saying, but instead to enter his mind, which is to say to see how he saw things. And so this landscape that you're entering, these paintings that you're looking at, it becomes a process of you thinking. And so it's not only a depiction of something, but also a way for you to enter your own brain and examine the corners of your brain, examine how you think about things. So this painting doubles as not only a depiction of things, but also sort of a spiritual place where you can think, yeah, this is what I was saying, that it prompts you to think and it tempts you to consider. Vaishnavi, a scroll is it's an old way in which sheets were wrapped up. So a scroll is like if I took an A4 sheet and I furled it, like I rolled it very tightly, that would be like how a scroll looks. They used to make it with like different kinds of paper, old parchment and things like that. So that's what a scroll is. You know, what's interesting about this particular segment is also that they're saying, oh, the viewer matters and the participant matters and the participation of the viewer matters. But this is true of all sorts of paintings, right? Even if you're looking at like, I don't know, a very realistic depiction of this room, for instance, you still need some kind of time to look at different parts of it and see, you know, that there is, say, a pillow here or a book there, or maybe underneath like the sofa there will be like a dog lying there. You know, so you still need some time, you still need to put some sort of effort into it, but you're appreciating it, you know. But the difference between Chinese painting and Western painting, the author tells us, is that you won't be appreciating it because of how realistic it is, but because of how much work it kind of mentally makes you do. Chinese painting makes you do. Another thing is also that there's a difference of degree, right? Even if like I have like a painting for you that depicts something and you need to look at it and you still need to like engage with it to see what's happening in it, you're engaging with it on a different level. One, you're probably trying to find like the things in it rather than maybe think about it. But even if you're thinking about it, there is a lot more limited material to think about. Whereas when it comes to, say, Chinese painting and this horizontal scroll especially, there is a lot more for you to look at and a lot more for you to think about. So all of that is also there. But we should keep in mind that the viewer does matter with everything. And really, that's also a sort of similarity that exists between Western and Chinese art and any kinds of paintings in general. The way the viewer perceives something definitely matters. This concept is expressed as Shree, literally mountain water, which used together represent the word landscape. So this concept, which concept? The idea that the landscape is an inner space, a spiritual space that painting can like lead you inside yourself, is described using the word Shui. And Shan and Shui are both characters in Chinese, like like we have, for instance, A and B. So Shan and Shui, Shan means mountain and Shui means water, and Shan and Shui, when put together, they make mountain water, and this is the word that people use to say landscape in China. Um, and that's very interesting because again, if like you ever think about like landscapes and somebody tells you to draw a landscape, you definitely tend to like draw mountains, and you definitely tend to draw water, or at least I seem to remember doing that in my childhood. Mountains, little river, a little house, sun like in between the mountains, so the fact that the word landscape is actually mountain water in China seems very appropriate. But what does this mean, right? Landscape doesn't just mean mountain and water. Mountain and water and these two characters of Shan and Shui also stand for something else. I'm going to read about that in this paragraph. More than two elements of an image, these represent two complementary poles reflecting the Taoist view of the universe. The mountain is yang, reaching vertically towards heaven, stable, warm and dry in the sun, while the water is yin, horizontal and resting on the earth, fluid, moist and cool. The interaction of yin, the receptive feminine aspect of universal energy, and its counterpart yang, active and masculine, is of course a fundamental notion of Taoism. So Taoism, as I told you, is a spiritual like idea in China. It's a philosophy in China, and this philosophy has a specific kind of belief, and you probably have seen stuff about it even if you haven't necessarily like read about it, right? And you must have seen this classic kind of symbol of yin and yang. Oh dear, it's a very small. Yeah, and what yin and yang are is this idea that in this universe there are two different kinds of forces, and both of them are completely different from each other, but they also fit together, right? Complementary, which is to say they're entirely different, but they come together and they make a whole. And that's what we see going on in this image of yin and yang that we're probably all familiar with also. We see this particular segment and this particular segment, and they seem entirely different from each other. The black and the white represent the differences, and yet they fit together into a circle, into a whole. And we're told here that that's what's going on with regard to this mountain water, with regard to Shan Shui also. We're told that the mountain stands for yang, which is one of the two forces, and yin is the water, which stands for the other of the forces. So together the mountain and the water come together as a whole to represent a balance in this universe, right? Both of the forces of the universe, both of the very different, very opposing forces of the universe come together in the mountain and the water being together. So in a landscape, the mountain and the water, yang and yin, come together to have a balanced view of the universe. And what does that mean? And we'll talk about that, right? We've already talked a little bit about it, but before we talk about it, let me tell you a little bit about what yang and yin here mean. So we're told that the mountain means yang, which means something that's reaching towards heaven, something that has all of these specific characteristics where it's stable, which is fixed, which is warm, which is dry in the sun. And then we have yin, which is horizontal because water flows like this, and it rests on the earth, which is to say it's not stretching towards the heavens, it's quite flat. It's fluid, which is in opposition to the stability of the mountain, the fixedness of the mountain. The rivers are moving. It's moist where the mountain is warm. It's cool where the mountain is dry. And we see basically that these are constructed as being different also, right? There's an opposition being drawn in the characteristics that these two things have, and they're linked to the characteristics of the mountain and the water, but presented to us in the form of yang and yin as universal forces, and how they're different. And we're told also that yin is this receptive and feminine aspect of energy, and yang is a more active and masculine aspect of universal energy. Again, this entire notion of these two sources of energy being very different, feminine x masculine, receptive x active, those are things, I mean, those associations are things that, you know, we'd all question today, but that's part of this philosophy, right? That there is balance achieved when all of these things come together, and there is an interconnectedness between all of these things. And so we found out that mountain and water, which is landscape, is representative of different parts of Taoism. Yeah, we'll talk about that also. And actually, let me talk to you a little bit about what this means immediately right now. So what we're getting here is that in a landscape painting, any painter is expected to have both yang and yin, which is to say this kind of balance between these two energies. And what the painting is supposed to do is help us see the kind of balance that is possible in the universe. That's also why it's described as a journey, right? You look at the painting, and you know that path that we talked about, the way to seeing balance in the universe? Yeah. So the painting is supposed to show you this way. And that's also the journey that you take when you look at these paintings, right? And that's also the relevance of landscape paintings in China, that they kind of help you move towards becoming, to following the Taoist way of life, that kind of balance. And there's another element to this Taoist way of life, which is the middle void. What is often overlooked is an essential third element, the middle void, where their interaction takes place. This can be compared with the yogic practice of pranayama. Breathe in, retain, breathe out. The suspension of breath is the void where meditation occurs. The middle void is essential. Nothing can happen without it. Hence the importance of the white, unpainted space in Chinese landscape. So there is yin and yang according to the Taoist way of life, but there is also a third thing, which is called the middle void. And the middle void is where yin and yang come together, right? And think about this as like maybe an empty space where both yin and yang kind of come together and meet. And the author compares it to pranayama, which, you know, is breathing practice. You draw breath in through one nose and you let it through the other. And what happens when you do pranayama is you breathe in, you pause for a minute, not that long, for a couple of seconds, and then you breathe out through the other nostril. And the sort of moment in between where you just pause rather than breathing in or breathing out, that moment is where the void is located, right? That in-between kind of moment where meditation occurs, where there is a pause, there is no action, and instead there is emptiness and space for thinking. And so the painter tells us that this is something that is important when it comes to yin and yang and the Taoist way. And we found out already that these paintings pride themselves on showing people the Taoist way, right? Getting them to understand Taoism and how to live their lives as per it. And so even in these paintings, there is a representation for the middle void also, and that is the unpainted spaces in the painting. So if you go and look up like Chinese landscape paintings, then you'll see that there are actually like expanses of like sky and stuff which are just blank. They won't be painted at all. And what they stand for is the middle void, is that in between space where you can think, where meditation happens. Yeah. And what that tells us again is the incredible amount that painting is borrowing from philosophy, right? It's so intense the way that painting follows philosophy that there is even white space to depict this third element. Um, Everything that is relevant to the philosophy somehow shows up in the painting. So painting is immensely guided by this philosophy. This is also where man finds a fundamental role. In this middle void, is where human beings become important. In that space between heaven and earth, he becomes the conduit of communication between both poles of the universe. His presence is essential even if it's only suggested. Far from being lost or oppressed by the lofty peaks, he is, in Francois Cheng's wonderful expression, the eye of the landscape. So, that's a bit of a confusing paragraph. So before we get into it, I'm going to ask if we have any other questions actually. Okay. No other questions, I think. Um, so this final paragraph, right? It tells us that the middle void is where human beings become important. Um, Human beings are kind of considered to be in between heaven, which is, as we found out, yang, the mountain reaching towards heaven, and earth, which is yin, the water that is on earth. And in between both of these is human beings, and human beings become the way for these two different parts of the universe to kind of communicate to each other, which is to say that human beings do the work of connecting both of these poles of the universe, right? And how is that? We are on earth and we are trying to figure out a way to get to heaven, I suppose you could say. That's a really bad way of putting it again, but basically we spend our lives sort of in Taoism especially. We try to find ways to live this ideal life, right? And that's a way of trying to find a balance between heaven and between earth, between yang and between yin. And in finding that balance, we become the way to keep both of these things in contact within us also. But this is also true of the paintings, right? We see like little like images of people in these landscapes also, and in the landscapes also the presence of these people is very important. And I mean, his presence is essential even if it's only suggested, which is to say, even if there isn't like a person who is drawn into the painting, even if there's only like, say, maybe firewood or a hut or something like that that indicates that a human being lives there, it's still important. It still tells us that human beings are relevant enough to be in that painting. And why are they there? They're there to be the eye of the landscape, and we'll talk about that phrase. But first, human beings are not lost or oppressed by the lofty peaks, which is to say that even though they're like these very tiny things on the earth, they're not those mountains that are there, those big and terrifying mountains, are not things that make them frightened or that have power over them. So they're not being held back by those mountains, they're not being confused by those mountains. Rather, they become the eye of the landscape, which is to say the center of the landscape, the eye in the landscape also, because they're there in the landscape, and it's, if you imagine the way that they must be looking at everything in the landscape, then that's one way for you to enter the painting, right? But also because we human beings who are outside the painting are also going to be looking at the landscape, and we are the eyes that are looking at the landscape and entering the landscape and the interior world of the landscape, which is giving us all of this information, all of this space to think about balance between yin and yang. And so that's why human beings are important, not only as depictions within the painting, but also outside the painting, in life. Um, and that was a lot. I thought this lesson would be really, really short, but it took a lot of time. There are a bunch of themes that we should talk about with regard to this lesson. But first, I'm looking at the chat again, and hello to Sai Rachita Behera. It's nice to have you. Yes, Tanu, you're right in that it does have a rich history, art, and there's a lot of philosophy here also that inspires this art. And also, you're definitely right that it's supposed to have a sort of life of its own for each viewer who comes across it, which is to say that if I looked at it and you looked at it, then we'd both experience different things when we're looking at it. So definitely, like in that sense, life of its own. Themes, one theme that we definitely saw is how different places and different cultures shape different styles of art, which is to say also that, if we go to a new country and we see the art there and we don't entirely understand it, it might be because we are entirely new to it and we don't know enough to kind of gauge what's happening in those paintings. And maybe we can't entirely comprehend it until we understand more of the culture of that country, or unless someone explains to us what's going on in that piece, so all of these things end up mattering to how we perceive art. Another thing we see is that we kind of have to be open to different styles of art and open to appreciating things that are different as they come, right? And by that I mean, to give you a weird example, if you're reading a mystery thriller novel, then you can't dislike that mystery thriller novel because it's not a romance, right? If you're looking for a romance, then you have to read a romance and you can appreciate it there. But you basically can't set the standard of romance on a mystery thriller. And so similarly, when you're experiencing a particular style of painting, you have to appreciate it for what it is, rather than try to look at it and compare it to other different kinds of standards that exist in different styles and saying, no, you have to be like this, because that would be an unfair way of kind of thinking about this. That would be like saying, oh, you're not a poem, so I won't like you, to a novel, which doesn't really make sense because it's not trying to be a poem at all. So that's something that we get. And of course, what we get finally from Landscape of the Soul is that paintings are not only an entry into the painter's minds and your mind, but also a way for you to think about all of these things that are very spiritual and very important, and so very important to your soul. And so that's why we get this title, which is Landscape of the Soul. Painting is connected very deeply to the features of our souls and how we see our souls and how we understand them. And that draws us to the end of the content in this lesson. There is a little bit that I want to tell you about that is in a little box at the very end of this chapter. So I think I will do that now. Let me know if you can still see me and hear me, because suddenly you're just completely gone from my screen. By which I mean I'm gone from my screen. Okay. There's a little segment at the end of this lesson in a little box, and we'll go through it really quickly. Okay. It's called Getting Inside Outside Our Art, ends by Brinda Suri. When French painter Jean Dubuffet mooted the concept of art brut in the 1940s, the art of the untrained visionary was of minority interest. So in the 1940s, this French painter called Jean Dubuffet began the concept of art brut. And art brut is a thing in which untrained painters and untrained artists make art. So you've not undergone professional training and you're going to make art, and that art is called art brut. And it's the art of the untrained visionary, which is to say someone who's not been trained but who has visions, ideas, dreams of what they can do with art. But this is something that was of minority interest, which is to say not a lot of people were very interested in it. From its almost veiled beginnings, outsider art has gradually become the fastest growing area of interest in contemporary art internationally. But although it was something that wasn't very interesting back then, um, and in fact it was so little of interest that it seemed almost veiled, which is to say almost hidden, um, outsider art has actually become one of the most important and most fascinating things today. This genre is described as the art of those who have no right to be artists, as they have received no formal training, yet show talent and artistic insight. So, art brut is the art of people who haven't received formal training, which means that they don't have any right to be artists, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But these people, though they haven't been trained, also show a lot of talent, and they also show a lot of artistic thinking. Their works are a stimulating contrast to a lot of mainstream offerings. And what happens is, because they haven't been trained in a particular style and been told what to paint and how to paint, they think in very different ways than the people who have been trained think. So all of this sort of, so for instance, if you're being told, all these years while you're learning painting, oh, this is how you should mix paint and this is how you should paint things, you're going to get a bunch of people following that, and you're going to have like a particular popular kind of art that's formed, and a style that you can see repeated everywhere in that. And then you get all of these people who haven't been trained like that, and so they start thinking in ways that are very different from it, and so they do all sorts of unique new things, and so their work ends up being very different from the work that the people are doing in the mainstream. And a bunch of like things that we get here is the idea of outsider art and of some people having no right to do art, which is to say that art is also something that's very strongly regulated, right? And there's like condescension in art, like there is condescension in everything. And if you're not trained in specific ways in specific schools, then you're going to be told, oh, your art isn't real art, you're not really doing art, you're not really an artist. So art brut is the art of people who have been told sort of that you're not artists and you haven't been trained in art, but they go ahead and they kind of pursue art anyway. Around the time Dubuffet was propounding his concept, in India an untutored genius was creating paradise. Years ago, the little patch of jungle that he began clearing to make himself a garden sculpted with stone and recycled material is known to the world today as the Rock Garden at Chandigarh. So around the same time that Dubuffet was coming up with this concept of art brut, in India there was somebody who was already practicing art brut. He is an untutored genius, so somebody who is not trained, but he is brilliant and he is creating paradise. So he is making this piece of jungle that he has found and he's clearing up, and he's using stone and recycled materials to make a garden. And it's a beautiful garden, and it's so beautiful, and all of the art that he's made in it with stone and recycled material is so beautiful that it seems like paradise. And in fact today it's a very famous tourist spot which is known as the Rock Garden, and it's in Chandigarh. Its 80-year-old creator director Nek Chand is now hailed as India's biggest contributor to outsider art. So his name is Nek Chand. He is 80 years old at the time that this article was written, and he is celebrated as India's biggest contributor to brut art. The 50th issue of Raw Vision, a UK-based magazine pioneer in outside art publications, features Nek Chand and his rock garden sculpture, Women by the Waterfall, on its anniversary issue's cover. There's this magazine called Raw Vision which seeks to kind of focus on this kind of outsider art, this kind of brut art, and it's called Raw Vision because it's not honed, it's not sharpened or trained, it's raw skill, raw vision, raw imagination, untrained imagination, uncooked, so to speak. And it features this man Nekchand, and it features one of his sculptures on it. The notion of art prut or raw art was of works that were in their raw state as regards cultural and artistic influences. Anything and everything from a tin to a sink to a broken down car could be a material for a work of art, something Nekchand has taken to dizzying heights. So art prut is artwork that is, not really regarded culturally or very artistically like popular, and they've not had a lot of things that have influenced them. For instance, you can't be like, this particular style of art is influenced by that style of art which came 7 years ago. It's not like that. That comes again with that kind of training, right? You've spent years in a studio, and you've sort of spent like years learning that this particular school of painting existed and that particular school of painting existed, and all of that influences you. And in art prut, there isn't any distinct sort of influence like that. Rather, you're just using whatever is available around you from like wasted things to use them. You turn them into like art, and Nekchand is particularly good at it. Recognizing his art as an outstanding testimony of the difference a single man can make when he lives his dream, the Swiss Commission for UNESCO will be honoring him by way of a European exposition of his works. The 5-month interactive show, Realm of Nekchand, beginning October, will be held at leading museums in Switzerland, Belgium, France, and Italy. So UNESCO, which celebrates culture of different places, it's a branch of the UN. The Swiss Commission for UNESCO decides to celebrate his work by, setting up this exhibition of his works in Europe, which is called Realm of Nekchand, and it's going to be held in leading museums in multiple places. It's a 5-month interactive show, which is to say people will come, they'll look at it, they'll get to see things, they'll get to properly talk about it and engage with the art in some way. The biggest reward is walking through the garden and seeing people enjoy my creation, Nekchand says. And Nekchand says, the thing I'm enjoying the most is that people, are getting to see my things and like my things, and that's what I like the most. Why add this extract to the article, right? We go back again to that question of difference that we were talking about not judging, say, a romance novel for a mythical, for a mysterious novel, for a mystery novel, and that same idea comes through in this article. It shows us that very often we are used to judging things on the basis of what we know, rather than judging them on the terms that they are made on. And so, for instance, we can't look at a piece of art prut or outsider art and say, it's not a painting painted with oil colors, and so I can't really like it and I don't think it's good. Very often the standards that we have for what is good comes from what we know already, like all of these trained painters, for instance, are trained to look at a particular thing and look at that as good. And that can be a very limiting worldview, because then you can't look at other things and see the beauty in them. And that kind of thing is happening with regard to art prut. That's why it's called like outsider art, right? It's art that's not really art, that doesn't really belong to art. And so we see that there is a politics also that comes with art, that comes with the fact that art comes from culture. And again, this article is there in this larger lesson. It's connected to the larger lesson because of this theme of the politics of art and how we perceive art, right? You can't look at a Western painting and say, it's not giving me what a Chinese painting would. And you can't look at Chinese painting and say, it's not giving me what a Western painting would. And the standards that exist in the world are quite often predominantly biased towards certain segments of society and focus on certain ways of understanding art. For example, even I know more about, say, I don't know, how an oil painting would look than, say, how a Chinese landscape scroll would look. And I'm also used to thinking about art as, if it depicts things realistically, then it's good. But reading this gives you this understanding that there are different ways of understanding art and different ways of appreciating art, and that's kind of what this chapter gives us, right? This kind of politics that comes with art, and this kind of ways of understanding art that stem from our cultures and our political and the places that we come from. So yeah, those are all some things that I wanted to very quickly add. I know a lot of that wasn't very clear. We'll hopefully talk about it again when we're revising this, which is on Saturday. So be there for the MCQ that will happen on Saturday. We'll be doing a quiz. It'll be a Menti quiz, and we'll have some fun revising the last two things that we studied, which is Landscape of the Soul and the Laburnum. Thank you for being here with me today on the Unacademy platform. There is also an Unacademy app that you can download off of Play Store, and you can try all the features on it for free. You can use my code for that. It's THAR01. The app has a lot of features on it, especially this one feature called Ask a Doubt, which is a really cool feature. You can take a picture of a question that you have and you can upload it to the subject the question falls under, and people will basically respond to you with a solution to that question. And this is really cool because it gives you a chance to clear your doubts, right? Especially before lessons, or even if you're just, I don't know, if you don't have any other resources to clear your doubts from, if something in school confused you, then you should just use the Ask a Doubt segment. You can use it on the app, download it, and use the Ask a Doubt thing. Like you can see it here, right? It's like a little like Ask a Doubt. Yeah. I also want to let you know that there's something called Unacademy Plus that you can subscribe to. There are a lot more courses that Unacademy offers, which you can access if you subscribe to the Plus. You'll get unlimited access to the courses, you'll get unlimited access to the study material of the courses, and you'll get unlimited access to a lot of practice tests and live tests that we do. And there will also be like very in-depth coverage of all the syllabus that you have for all of your subjects. These are the prices of Unacademy Plus. Different prices for different months, different durations of time. And you can see that the per month cost is a lot less for a longer duration of time. 24 months, for instance, is just 1,000 rupees per month. So Unacademy Plus, these are the prices, and you should keep in mind that longer durations are basically less expensive. There's also something called Unacademy Iconic, and Iconic is when you get personal attention from an educator. You get to work very closely with them one-on-one. They'll solve your doubts. You'll get weekly reports about how you're doing, so your parents will be in the loop about how you're doing, and you'll always have access to all of the free benefits that Unacademy has to offer also, all of the other things that Unacademy has to offer also. And the benefit of Iconic is really that you get somebody who will help you figure out what's going on with you and work with your individual style of studying. And so they'll help you kind of figure out your weaknesses, your strengths, how studying might work better for you. And so very, very individualized pattern of working. And these are the prices for Iconic. And you can see again that 2,000 per month is the cost that you'll have if you take a subscription for 24 months, which is different from a 6-month subscription, which costs 2,833 per month. So if you get a longer subscription, again it costs less per month. For both of these, you can use my code again. It's THAR01, and that'll give you a 10% discount on both of these things. Thank you for being here today, and if you like today's class, then please leave a like. If you are looking for more content like this, then definitely subscribe and leave comments with your questions and your feedback. I am very much looking forward to hearing back from you. It helps to know how I'm doing, what's working for you, what's not working for you, and that helps me structure my lessons better. So yeah, see you next time.